So I'm going to talk today about the ancient yew tree and bring together some different threads that relate to the yew tree to demonstrate just how much the yew tree is embedded in a sense in our culture, in our blood, in the land, and how that has been minimized and how that's become quite an invisible aspect of our culture. And really it's part of a creation mythology that we have lost and that we desperately need back. Creation mythology, and also a pathway towards the transition to death. And the yew tree stands at that crossroad, at that boundary. It's essentially a portal. The yew tree is the ultimate portal, really, and it was used as such for thousands of years.
Times in the hands of God, Erin put on a cloak of rocks and stones. 3 times in the hands of the great Creator, Erin put on a coat of trees. 1,000 years before our first forefathers ever breathed, they were awake.
The earliest known name for the yew is the Hittite Aya from about 1750 BCE. And it means eternity, or intriguingly, to be touched by eternity. The yew has amazing strategies for survival. It can branch layer, as you saw from that first image. It can actually grow branches down from quite high up in the tree that will actually descend down as sweeping arcs to come back down onto the ground, across the ground, and actually as runners, and will create actually new trees, basically clones of itself. It seems to belong to another earth, seems to belong to a kind of another era of the earth, if you like. It doesn't really fit this era in terms of its life forces. Rhythmicity, just this sense of endless time in this space. And this is where I began to get this connection between the yew and Saturn. So I began to see that what was being shown under the yew through these beings was a kind of Saturnian universe, an era before the seasons had differentiated because there was no sun. To enter that chamber of the yew, to work with the yew, is to basically begin to work with its Saturnian consciousness. But in order to do that, we have to train our consciousness. We can't just walk into a yew and expect this to happen. And the 9 years under the tree was a training for me to begin to enter that yew safely. You can't do it through your nervous system. You have to become embryonic to be able to touch. You have to become original. You have to go back to that same originality in yourself, and you have to recreate that, rebuild that in yourself.
You want to come and see the yew tree? I said, sorry, the what tree? He said, the yew tree, it's up. I said, no, I don't know what a yew tree is. He said, are you kidding? You don't know what a yew tree is? We ended up in this big, what I looked like a big bush. And he said, on you go, in you go. I said, in, what are you talking about? In where? And there was a hole, a black hole in this bush, which looked like a bush. He said, there, come on, go. Whoever I bring has to go first. You have to go first. So I ducked down, And it was a tunnel of low branches. Probably if I put my hands out, I would meet spiked branches. I'd lift my head up, I would meet spiked branches. So you had to 40 feet or so of crawling through this tunnel. Not crawling, but just kind of walking, crawling. Come up into a rise, then into an opening. And really, in the center of that opening was a trunk of a tree. And I went over to the trunk and I looked up and I realized that the branches grew out 11 or 12 feet out into space and dropping down back into the earth, forming new trees and carrying on. And this was my first introduction to the ancient yew tree, a female ancient yew tree. And just as I was looking, Bob came up behind me and said, "Welcome to an unknown wonder of the world," which it is, and began to explain to me a little bit about the tree. Could be a little. Yew trees cannot be dated because their heartwood rots. The tree, the yew tree, it continuously regenerates itself. It continuously births itself out of itself. So it's the oldest tree in Europe, and it's also the most juvenile tree in Europe simultaneously. And that, in some ways, is the essence of the yew tree, the essence that was known thousands and thousands of years ago, and which was gradually part of our heritage after the last ice age, especially around the Black Sea area where there's huge yew stands. So if you walked with your back against the bole of the tree like we're sitting here, if we walked forward probably about 25 feet, you would come to where the first branches dropped into the ground.
Wow.
And a perfect circle, almost perfect circle. A sense of sleepiness, and then being brought out of that with these sudden convulsions where I was actually almost being thrown up off the ground and back down, slammed back down. And those convulsions lasted for 3 years under the tree. As my body felt like my body was being changed. So at first it was a very, very visceral experience. And gradually it changed into more of an experience where I began to see visions under the tree of things that happened there, ritual that was carried out there, particular spirits that would appear. And of course the yew tree itself is its own archetype, is its own thing. It was able to, somehow the tree is, the knowledge in the tree, as I said, was like a language that was written on written into my body. And I didn't have any human teachers. I've never had any human teachers. I have people who inspire me, but I haven't had any teachers as such, and so it was the tree that was really my teacher.
Yeah.
Which sounds very, very odd nowadays to say that, and particularly in a kind of where we have this nice view of nature, of going out into nature and hugging trees. This was really not that kind of experience. When I hugged the tree, it was going to hug me right back in a way that I would like to describe to you.
Yeah, but I feel like this is important information that that a person can be initiated based on a personal experience and an interaction with nature. It's not necessarily a passed on tradition for all people. For some people there are initiate traditions, but in some ways it's to have been put in the position of having to really open your awareness and learn from something that's more subtle, in some way more challenging because it's not being handed to you.
Yeah, and that's a really good point you're making, because it's taken me up until quite recently to actually be able to make sense out of a lot of the experiences that I had, because I had no framework to put it in, nobody to tell me. There wasn't a set stage of initiations that I was led through by humans, by teachers. Although under the tree many times I was led through ritual by spirits who were, I would say, were involved in a yew cult, and who were able to help me at certain points. But
so there was in some ways a human tradition, but it was through the spirit realms that you connected to it, not through someone said, "I'm going to take you and teach you this stuff."
Yeah, there's nobody left to teach it.
Yeah, there's no one left to teach it.
I feel that a lot of that, I feel that there's some ways a responsibility that a lot of that knowledge was given to me, and it's like it's almost like I've been given this knowledge, and now I have to make sense of it, and I have this responsibility to present it in a way which is responsible and conveys the depth and the power of of transformation and healing, which is what the yew tree is really all about, what the cult of the yew tree was all about, was having a sense of understanding what we need in order to heal, and an understanding of a sense of rejuvenation that comes from moving ourselves back to a place which is more about origins and about our beginnings, healing coming from that place rather than dealing just with symptoms. And the healing, which is something that Mircea Eliade talks about in his books, the myth of the eternal return, which you see in many other cultures, was also practiced in, but certainly in the British Isles and certainly in Ireland when the yew trees were abundant. The sense of the womb-like nature of the yew tree, and healing being something that was about going back to origins, back to the place where our spirit first crossed into that place of matter. Embodying that place. You can see this is the 13th rune, the yew rune. It's a tree that grows both upwards and downwards at the same time. And I'm just going to be linking some of that symbolism and some of the gesture and having you sort of feel into that gesture of something that grows upwards and downwards at the same time and how that might feel in your body. Because the ancient practices that came from the yew tree had to be embodied. These practices were embodied. And so this is the ancient yew tree in East Lothian in Scotland. It's quite an extraordinary tree. It's reputed to be 2,000 years old, but I'm going to talk through this talk. I'm going to show you that this tree is actually probably a lot older than that even. It looks like a bush. And you can see that dark space there, and that's basically the opening. This is the entrance of this ancient yew tree. Incredible passage of essentially just of yew wood. And this is all the one tree. 3 lifetimes of the yew for the world from its beginning to its end. So you get this sense of how old and how ancient this tree actually is. If it's in actually documented and understood even in the 15th century. This is an incredibly ancient tree, female tree. The yew trees are either female or male. So now going up north to Scotland, this is the Fortingal yew, and it's about 52.5 feet, or at least it was, around. And you can see with the staves they have on the ground here, this is marking the original size of the tree. So the Fortingal yew was the axis mundi of Scotland at one time. This was the absolute centre of Scotland, quite close to Shehallion, which is the fairy hill in Scotland. So this was the absolute centre. This tree is reputed to be 9,000 years old. It could be a lot older, in fact. And the Fortingal yew now is very little left of it, apart from this kind of these pieces of it, basically its outer shell, which are still growing really well and being quite healthy, in fact. And this is a yew in Leeds that has actually a door on it, and I think the story goes here that there was a family of gypsies actually living in there for a while. So these trees are quite incredible. So what happened to the trees? We have so few left now, hardly any in Ireland and very few in the British Isles. We're like a sort of a museum of these trees now. They're national treasures, and of course they're still not protected. But we can see here from 18th century topiary where there was this craze back then to sort of carve these trees up. So we're going to look a little bit at what happened to the tree, what befell the yew tree, what kinds of travesties happened to this tree. So we can see here belts and chains are used. What tends to happen is the yew tree rushes to go hollow. It has a strategy of hollowing itself out. It grows up from the ground, exposes its roots and becomes hollow. And anybody engineer is going to know that a hollow tube is stronger than a cylinder, than a thick cylinder. So the yew's strategy was to hollow itself. It sends its energy out through its branches back into the ground and creates clones of itself, which come back into the ground and continue. And that first tree I showed you, the tree in East Lothian, they basically are essentially immortal. They can continue like that indefinitely if they are not tampered with. Unfortunately, the trees, as you can see, are very tampered with, and they have been for a long time, especially the ones in graveyards, where we know that these trees predated the graveyards. These were there before the graveyards. And of course, the branches are cut so that long branches don't come down into the ground and go into mess with the corpses in the graveyards, go into their mouths and all of that sort of thing, and bring these people back from the dead, which of course would happen. So we can see here that what actually happens is the actual strategy of the natural strategy of the yew to actually come back into the ground has to be replicated artificially. So if this tree had been left alone, it would have actually just come back into the ground and created incredible strength and stability for itself, creating clones of itself and continuing to grow. But of course, these buttresses had to be put in to do what the yew would do naturally. But as we know, the yew trees will, because their strategy is to grow hollow, to become hollow, hundreds and hundreds of years can go by, if not longer, and suddenly a little shoot might appear in the ceiling, in the cavern, the upper cavern of this tree, an aerial shoot, which will over hundreds of years grow down through space to connect itself back in the ground again and create a new trunk. Now, of course, to allow that to happen in the amount of time. So you can see here the natural strategy of the yew is to grow back down into the ground. And you can see here the tree that grows upwards and downward at the same time. So it's actually rising up out of the ground, exposing its roots. Now if you turn that picture upside down, it would look the same. So you can see this inverted tree idea beginning to show up here. And the bark gives off a hallucinogenic toxin, which is quite well known now. So there's a very, very potent sentient being which contains information. There's an informational content, something. So anything that enfolds space there's a powerful gesture to fold in on yourself, fold space. It's almost an embryonic quality to this that is containing space and separating the sacred space from the inside to the space on the outside. So crawling in through this tree was always an initiatory experience for me. And the first 3 years were incredibly painful. Lots of incredibly bad fits that I had, so seizures almost under this tree. And the second period of 3 years was more about a sense of gaining some sort of sense of working with this kind of sort of visceral quality of light that seemed to be appearing under the tree. There's tendrils of light under this tree that will come and meet you. Tree, it's extraordinary. It's like a kind of it's like almost like a liquid in the atmosphere that you can actually shape and move with your hands, which I've been using now a lot in my healing practice. And it's quite extraordinary work that the yew has been teaching my body over these years. You can see how far these branches will travel. You can see that branch there at the top, how far that will travel. And this tree is amazing because it's actually created different caverns. So you can think of the pre-Celtic peoples having these practices here with these separate caverns. So this tree here, you can go from one container, one sort of cave shape into another. And these are amazing. They're all joined. So you can move from all of these different spaces under this tree, and they're all for very specific reasons. Here's the base of that tree. So what happened to the trees? Where did they all go? So we're going to be looking at how prevalent they once were. Eboracum, which the Romans called York, based on an older name. It's called Yew Town, basically. It's named after a yew. So at one time there were yews all over that area, all over York. And just any cursory look at place names in the UK just gives it all away. And this is incredible. This becomes very, very significant. Something we've lost here is the amount of places that are named in this country and in Ireland and Wales. The yew tree is prevalent throughout the UK, the British Isles, in the names. So it's imprinted into the land when the yew trees no longer exist. So we're going to turn a little bit now to Norse mythology to bring some pieces together. Asgard itself is located in Yew Valley, protected by the river Ifing, which is a Yew River. And in the Voluspa, it says the Azure met, who raised on the Idavol, Yew Hill, altars and high temples. So clearly, we're talking about this incredible significance in Norse mythology. And it's certain that Yggdrasil was a yew tree. Heimdall, hallowed seed, greater and humbler sons of Heimdall, the opening of the Voluspa. And Heimdall is actually the world tree, anthropomorphized. Because Heim means world, and Dal means tree. So Heimdall actually means world tree. So we're seeing here that some deities and gods and goddesses who were originally yew trees, having been personified over time. So some of our earliest encounters with the deities were with these yew trees, because they were so powerful, they were so long-lasting. Generations and generations and generations would have seen them and practiced on them, and they would have been used for initiatory rites and healing and all kinds of passages into birth and also passages into death. So Heimdall is the world tree. Now he's born of 9 mothers who are also sisters, the Vidia. And Vid means tree, but Evid could mean yew root or yew tree. So Heimdall is born from 9 yew roots or yew trees. So it gets even more dense here that Heimdall, the world tree, is born. He comes from the yew tree. And botanists will say that a couple of trees in Ireland gave birth to all the yew trees in the world. So he's also the guardian of the apple of life and death. It's given to him by Iduna. So what's the apple of life and death? Could it be the yewberry? Have any of you here tasted the yewberry? Yeah? You didn't take the seed though. We're still here. And it's incredibly significant that these could have been the apples of life and death. And the whole practice was built up around the yew trees that was lost, or was it? So Iduna held the secret of regeneration. She could have been Ida, Dana, Diana. All the connections are there. The daughter of Ivaldi. And Ivaldi is Ul. It's another name for Ul, the deity ruling in yew, as he's called. So what happened to all of this? How come we don't know all of this? In fact, Mount Ida and the Cretan mountains, again, could be named after yew trees. The yew tree is a mountain tree, remember. So these trees at the tops of the mountains would have been venerated, and the mountains would have been possibly named after them. So the nine mountain mothers could actually have been originally yew trees, again, anthropomorphized. Here's a picture of Ul on his yew skis and with his yew bow. And he lived in Altoona, Euler's yew grove. So you can't really get too much clearer than this. There's incredible depth of knowledge here that's been lost about the yew tree was clearly incredibly significant. King Ida of Britain, 547 Common Era. And he lived in this place called Yevering Bell. So, place of the sacred yew tree. So we see it showing up and connected with kingship, which is a very significant connection, which we'll be looking at in a second. The Paps of Anu in Ireland. So the kind of the living landscape here, personified as the queen of the underworld, Danu. She has 3 brothers named after yew trees. Yewowar, fork in the yew tree, Yuanith, yew foliage, Fer-E, which is her brother, man of yew, all connected to the yew tree. Dada, the mighty, her father, also connected to the yew tree.
But the chief druid of the Tuatha was the Doida, the All-Father. The Tuatha took counsel amongst themselves, and they decided that they would invade Erin and take it for their own. For they came from the 4 cities of instruction, which were not in this world or in this universe at all, but in a universe near to it. And they sailed in special ships to Erin, and they landed there on the 1st day of May, and they burned their boats upon the shore. Instructed in the 4 cities, Lord of the 3 wheels, sage of the knowledge of waters, Lord of the grove, Lord of the animals, sage of the stars of heaven, All-Father, crowned with stag horn, crowned with green leaves, rebirth of the world.
And then we get to Fionn, the 5 sacred trees of Ireland that were planted from the yew branch. And 2 of the trees are certainly yews, but it's possible that all 5 of them were. And there's been misreadings. So Fionn means a red tree. And the salmon of knowledge is Fionn. And the word for salmon and the word for yew have a similar connection in Yeo. So I often wonder about some of you may have read about this too, with the great work of Alan Meredith, that the sort of hazelnuts of knowledge staining the salmon's belly red. Hazelnuts are not red. So this kind of offering, or this touching this practice somehow, and the salmon is very significant to the yew tree. And this whole notion of staining the belly red, hazelnuts are not going to do that. So it's possible that we're looking here at some kind of codified way of working with this, the hallucinatory qualities of the yew tree, the trance qualities of the yew tree. So there's a red tree. The yew tree is the red tree. And the bark is this has not been a doctored photograph. This is taken from Fred Hagenider's book, which I'd recommend anybody who wants to look at this further. Fred Hagenider's work on the yew tree is quite incredible, scholarly work. And this is the red tree. So the bark is actually often red like this. It's quite extraordinary how this has significance. Yew blood. These are the yews in Wales. And they're of course connected with the blood of Christ often. But they just bleed like this. They emit this kind of red ooze that looks like blood. And it's really, nobody really knows much about this. It's incredible that these trees actually bleed. The Crab Ruath, the Knights of the Red Branch, 4th to 10th century protectors of the royal house of Tara. So we're looking at this connection with kingship, with protection. The Knights of the Red Branch, the beginnings of the yew being kind of adopted or translated into sort of secret societies, or sort of a very exclusive kind of appropriation maybe of some of the power. Scatha, she taught Cuchulainn in a yew tree in Scotland. The arts of warfare, the arts of magic were taught to him by Scatha, the warrior in Scotland, under a yew tree, who's connected to the yew tree.
The heavens opened, and a great rain fell all over Ireland. And it was said that the gods themselves were weeping the death of the last true mortal hero.
I saw a wonder today on these ridges in the north. I beheld a yew bush on a stone, and I perceived a small oratory in front of it, and a flagstone before it. Angels were in attendance going up and down from the flagstone. Verily, said the Druid of Aid, that will be the residence of the King of Munster forever. And who shall first kindle a fire under that yew, from him shall descend the kingship of Munster. So again, the connections of the yew with kingship. So what were these connections, and why was that so significant? So we have to look, to find out the answer to that, we have to look a wee bit into history. So the yew was decimated. And
So what's the plan?
Same as Egypt, I guess find the local chieftain, knock on his door, find out what they want, who they hate, who they want punished for centuries of indescribable wrongdoing to their noble tribe, what sacred forests they want back. We listen carefully, very, very carefully, and we find a weak point, and we push. We push hard. 5 years from now, that sacred forest will be Roman ships carrying Roman soldiers to the next place, and so on and so on. gods of Britannia. I am Rome, and where I walk is Rome.
There's something I don't get.
What's that?
The Emperor says, here's one, lads. He wants to go back to those islands. The really fucking terrifying ones up there. Let's go back to that place Julius Caesar was too scared to spend more than 5 minutes in. I mean, what do they have up here? Besides trees and nightmares.
Lines up upon the Yew Tree, new perception of a feeling. Boycott in an old sleigh, blown out lantern length away. Rather than the petrichor from the drying grass, there was no trace there.
And many churches are surrounded by several yew trees, which could only have been a sacred grove or a place of worship for the Druids. And the Druids believed in reincarnation of sorts, so yew trees were seen as being immortal, able to grow their branches down to the earth to form new trees, which often twist together surrounding the original trunk. And as old branches die, new life can form within them. And the name of the island Iona in Scotland probably derived from Ioia, the Pictish word for yew. And the Celts considered it a symbol of death. And as it lived for such a long time, they thought it a sacred tree and possibly represented the tree of life. And the giant evergreen tree at the Temple of Uppsala, sacred to the Vikings, was thought to be an ancient yew tree. And one of the world's oldest surviving wooden artifacts is a yew spearhead, estimated to be around 400,000 years old, found in 1911 at Clacton-on-Sea in the UK. The yew was also sacred to Hecate, the Greek goddess of death, witchcraft and necromancy, and was said to be the liberator of souls after death. Now, yew tree is believed to root into the mouths of the dead in order to remove the soul, and was said to help purify the dead as they entered the underworld of Hades. Now, could this be why in England it is thought that yew trees were planted on the graves of plague victims to protect and purify the dead? Which I've witnessed in Ireham in Derbyshire, the famous plague village, yews grown out of graves. As I've explained, yews had a sacred role before the rise of Christianity, and many churches were built on the sites of so-called pagan temples, which explains a lot, as Christians and pagan imagery and beliefs were often overlapped, or the church absorbed the sites to help it convert locals to Christianity. Now, I think it was Pope Gregory who suggested taking advantage of this so that places of pagan worship could slowly absorb them into Christian churches. And as so many yew trees are over 1,500 years old, they must have grown there before Christianity arrived at their locations. And as there are at least 500 churchyards in England which contain yew trees older than the buildings themselves, it speaks for itself. And another piece of evidence I found which may support this is the fact that the Romans called one British tribe the people of the yew, after the places where they worshipped. Now, yew also suggests rebirth and resurrection to the Christian church, as it's a coniferous evergreen tree, and the heart of the tree is red while its sap is white, symbolising the blood and body of Christ. And royalty often use yew woods in their staffs and other regalia due to this Christian symbolism, and they think it represents power. All yew trees contain a poison that would harm or kill cattle that graze on them. So it may have been for practical reasons that planting yews in churchyards continued, a good reason to keep livestock out of graveyards, thus helping to preserve the holy ground and graves. And it's highly recommended not to sleep under yew trees, as even the ground can become poisonous underneath the trees. Not much vegetation tends to grow under them either, but it could be partly due to the lack of light under the thick foliage. Now, the poison of the yew actually has a positive. In Gloucestershire, at the Bathurst estate, it's shielded by one of the largest yew hedges in the world, and the prunings are used to make compounds used in chemotherapy. Unbelievably, 2 of the most useful chemotherapy drugs are actually derived from yew trees. Now, the yew tree was said to be vital for medieval soldiers, as yew's strong flexible branches were favoured for longbows, which create powerful weapons with a long range, to 250 metres, and could pierce chainmail and armour with the right arrowheads. And from 1252 onwards, men had to practice their archery by law, so longbow skills were taken very seriously by the kings of the time.
Some of you probably know this story, but the demands for the longbow were so incredibly high that the yews were basically destroyed for warfare. So this tree of rejuvenation, this tree of health, this tree of life, this Yggdrasil tree, this tree which is now known as a cure for cancer, was used for war. And significant to me that whatever we project onto that tree, whatever face we see that we project onto that tree, is a face that's going to come back to us. So when the tree there was a sense of the tree for warfare. The image was warfare. The trees were destroyed, and the longbow became this terrible weapon of war. About the 300 Years' War, 7,000 archers at that time could fire 70,000 arrows per minute. I mean, no army could withstand this incredible colossus of the English army at this time. All, of course, because of the yew tree. By the time of Henry IV, the medieval arms trade, it was a compulsory import of the wood. They were destroying the stands of yew in British Isles. So, and it says, enter upon the lands of private individuals and cut down yew or any other wood for the public service. So it was actually sanctioned. You could actually just go into somebody's land and cut down their yew tree. So when we look at all of this, it's an absolute miracle that these yew trees that I've shown you still exist. Who was protecting these yew trees? Who was looking out for those yew trees? What power was there to prevent these last sacred trees from being destroyed? Had to have been something going on there. By the time of Henry VIII, the yew was entirely imported, and the stands of the yew in Central Europe were completely gone, exhausted, and they have not recovered since. The yew has been described as the most negatively affected European tree. But we know that the tree has incredible powers of regeneration. This is an aerial root growing down from the arch of the hollow tree. And this aerial root here in the centre is hundreds upon hundreds and hundreds of years old. And this is now being left, so that eventually that will become the new trunk. So the yew trees are all about regeneration. And that's what they've always been about, regeneration. Certainly what I felt in my body in terms of my healing was being close to death and being actually transformed. But these are the Rus car figures from Hull. These were found under a bed of blue clay in the River Humber. They're from 500 BC. And they're carved in yew wood. And they're on a boat, a serpent boat. So think about that, the serpent boat. Where were they going? And they have here, you can see that they have actually a detachable penis. Why are you laughing? So this is where, for me, that begins to get very interesting. The penis is detachable, and inside there is a hole, and they found fragments of crystal fragments ground up inside this kind of pubic hole, if you like. And also the Ralligan figures in Ireland, the same thing.
But what's really important is the understanding that the ancients in Lascaux and other places in France travelled because of the Venus figurines and because of the mammoth beads and so forth. So I had to navigate, to travel, and what a lot of people in modern times don't appreciate is because we're born with trains and buses and planes and so forth, is that navigation across land is virtually impossible. And particularly in those days, when you try and take on board the mammoths and the giant elk and the huge herds of creatures that were in the plains and tundras and mainlands of continental Europe, were huge creatures before they were made extinct, and extremely dangerous, especially the saber-toothed tiger. And really, humanity, in my view, for the last 180,000 years lived on the periphery. The periphery is the edges of the continent where it joins the sea, and river mouths and places like that, where they weren't really exposed to the massive predators and herds, but yet were able to take advantage of them. And the spread of Venus figurines and the spread of the little beads, perfect little drilled beads made of mammoth tusk, from southern France right into northern Europe and into the Baltic regions and so forth, exactly the same type of manufactured item.
Yeah.
Okay, shows that these people traveled far and wide. To travel far and wide without roads means you have to travel by sea, but to travel by sea is fine. It's just how do you get up and down the estuaries and so forth. So we do still make boats like that. They're made in Ireland. They're called curraghs, and they're leather-bound boats. They're made of animal skin, and they float in only 18 inches of water. They travel around in this like family groups. There was Caesar in I think around 60 BC who commented that he'd seen boats like this on the Atlantic, up to 60, 70 feet long, and they flew like seagulls over the waves. It was so fast and so light. The beauty about those kind of boats is that they can be put in the water and lifted out of the water. And what we find is there's evidence that these boats were turned upside down wherever they landed and used as roofs of houses. And you can see that by sod enclosures or stone enclosures that are boat-shaped in Scandinavia, in the UK, in Ireland and so forth, and particularly near standing stones. So they managed to recover petroglyphs that show the boats and also the wheel cross. So really, when you look at the wheel cross as being a former protractor associated with a boat, then you have to ask the very simple question: if these people were able to travel to the south of France for the winter and then up into the colder regions for the summer, they were probably following the herds. And the great thing about the shallow draft of these boats was that they were able to lie in ambush for the herds as they crossed river mouths and so forth. Well, it's very interesting because people do have difficulties by putting countries and labels on these people, and they were known as children of the earth, or sea people, but they didn't live on the land. This is what people can't get their heads around. They lived at sea, or they lived in the peripheries of the sea, and they were completely nomadic, going with the seasons.
Yeah.
Which brings me back to navigation.
Did not people ever set up settlements in these ancient times?
No, I don't think that they did.
Right.
I think that the reason that settlements came about was because of the end of the Ice Age. Now, in the end of the Ice Age, you had mile and a half high cliffs of solid ice, and when the ice melted, it caused all sorts of ice dams, if you like, that push forward a moraine, and water in the middle raised to a great height. But when the cliffs of ice fell, they caused two tsunamis of unbelievable power. So that wiped out, at the same time as raising the sea levels up to 300 feet, wiping out a lot of our archaeological evidence, I'm sure. It wiped out the herds that the people were relied on for their hunting and for their food, kind of Garden of Eden, if you like, harvesting whatever was going north and south. Well, when the herds became wiped out, what happened was they decided or took on board agriculture. And that agriculture really started around 10 to 12,000 years ago, at the end of, as we know it, at the end of the last ice age. And it was at that time that they started to settle. But some still stayed hunter-gathering, some settled and become farmers, and became a division, I suppose, between the people. And then there were, of course, people who bridged it, as there are today. There are fishing fleets that go out harvesting the sea, yes, in the same way that farmers harvest the land.
So where was this boat going? We see here these boats, we see these ones from Sweden, where there's clearly transporting the sacred tree. Now where...
It was originally the task of each member of the order to be a compendium of all knowledge, all known knowledge. If humanity was totally wiped out, except for one individual, he should be capable of re-establishing everything from his own resources. The order, by tradition, came into existence after the last great cataclysm or catastrophe which affected the world. Now, with these great and terrible impacts on the earth by great electrical storms being caught up in the tails of meteors or showers of meteorites, civilization as we know it was totally destroyed. All knowledge came within the ambit of the order, but they were particularly concerned with astronomy because they had experienced so many very significant calamities. And it was thought that a full knowledge of astronomy would enable them to predict conditions when these calamities were likely to take place and take some kind of action to protect themselves.
Was that it needed an instrument that could measure not just vertical angles, but horizontal angles. And that's the difficulty. We're looking for an instrument that acted as a modern theodolite. I need a fulcrum. A fulcrum, like a crossbar. I'm trying to make a T-piece now. So I make a T-piece. You know something else that's very important. There was a law in Egypt, and that was particularly used in the weighing of the heart ceremony, which made it a law, was a plumb line. When they do the weighing of the heart ceremony, they made scales, and the scales were weighing the heart against, in the canopic jar of the pharaoh, against the feather of truth, known as the feather of Maat. Well, they used a plumb line on the scales. They used it because it was a law, and they had to make sure that it was absolutely bang on, otherwise it would send the pharaoh in the wrong direction. If you get my meaning.
Yes.
And so we know that plumb lines were important. We know that the Egyptians used them to a great degree, and so let's just use the plumb line. So what's the basic thing we need? Well, we need a wheel, and we need to stick it on an upright, and we need a crossbar to sight along, but we also need something else. We need to be able to look at it in a horizontal direction as well as a vertical direction. And so I put a wheel on, and I marked it out in 360 degrees using a simple protractor, extending the lines out so I could get it. And I got into my back garden, and I sighted the pole star, and I checked it against the GPS, and it was like within 20 miles. And I was standing there doing this, and found myself kneeling in front of the cross, and sighting the pole star, and it suddenly just hit. I thought, what is this? I've got a Celtic cross in my hand. I've seen these all my life, rather than a gigantic wheel cross. Of dividing down each degree into arc minutes, okay, was to make what's known as an exponential scale. Now, an exponential scale is very simple. It's like the rays of the sun, or any angle that goes from the center of zero outward.
Like the rays of the sun seen on the Akhenaten.
Absolutely,
the sun.
Exactly right. And so that, in fact, in that case, you can also say that Akhenaten was quite well aware of this. which is very similar to the rays of the sun from pictures of Akhenaton, showing life coming from the sun. The exponential scale is really a quarter of a circle, and it makes it much more accurate to do so, to make it like this, so that 1 degree comes broken down into 10 parts, similar to the decans, stars used by the Egyptians for measuring 36 decans times 10 is 360 degrees. And breaking it down, it breaks it down into arc minutes. It makes it a much smaller item to use for measuring with a plumb line. So if you can see that mounted on a cross staff, up and down, the plumb line hung from the top here, and what happens is the line, as it's tilted, measures off the angle along the degrees and arc minutes. And this is actually accurate to 3 arc miles at the equator of the Earth, which is very, very accurate indeed. It's 3 nautical miles, or 3 arc minutes, is a distance to the horizon, the place of time, the zone of Horus, if you like.
And so I looked for an exponential scale, and the reason I wanted an exponential scale is that you reduce the size of the instrument. It's almost like a vernier. It reduces the size of the instrument from a wheel. So you have a very simple scale rule, and of course it sprang to mind at the time, you know, things like yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, your rod and your staff will comfort me, means something now. An arc minute is equal to a nautical mile at the Earth's circumference. And so now it all starts to knit together, because it was accurate to 3 arc minutes, brings it within the viewable horizon at the equator of 3 miles. So in other words, if you can find, by using the stars, a measurement within 3 arc minutes, you can be pretty sure you were in 3 nautical miles, or within the view of the horizon. Now, of course, that opens up other things. What does horizon mean? Well, it's Horus, you know. Horus is about time, zone, the time of place, horizon. We use words nowadays and we forget the roots of where they come. The cross in its time was a very powerful instrument, a weapon of war, if you like. If you could find the time, and you could judge the season, and you could measure your enemy's land or your own land, and you could bring your ships and your troops to any position you wanted at precisely the right time, it's a powerful, powerful weapon. What fascinated me about the cross was that it became buried and lost, and hidden or not hidden or forgotten or whatever you want to call it. Those are all very emotive words. Was it lost, was it hidden, was it forgotten, or was it a combination of all those sort of things? It still couldn't die. And that's really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
That no matter what people do, they can't get rid of something that's there, even if it goes underground.
A lot of the time these lost things, we won't call them secrets, but these lost things are found in things like secret societies and religion.
Yeah.
Did you find confirmation in anything?
Yes. It's fragmented. We have an issue, don't we? I mean, let me give you an example. The formation of the written language is pretty well known to be a development that came about through necessity after it became forbidden to use graven image. So when it became forbidden in the Ten Commandments to use graven image, you now have an issue, don't you? The sign S means and sounds like serpent. So we're not allowed to draw serpents anymore because it's a graven image. So we make a very clever code, and that code becomes a letter. And then language is a letter. Very simplistic way of looking at it, but let's say that that's a way of doing it. Let's look at Greek mathematics. Now, Greek mathematics is totally unnecessary. I can teach a child to create a pyramid, incorporate pi, the golden section, square the circle, all the great Greek mathematical problems in 3 minutes flat. A child of 4 can do it every time and never make a mistake.
Every great civilization has a record of a period of a golden age when there was no war, no dispute, no lying. And this was attributed to the fact that language had not been discovered, and the telepathic function was the principal means of communication. Now, in relation to the order, those of the few isolated settlements which survived on the European coastline discovered that some retained the telepathic power, but most of them, because of the terrible traumas and trials they had undergone, had lost it. These isolated groups then began to migrate east, and in so doing they had to, in their isolation, develop languages as a means of communication. It does explain why disparate groups scattered all over the earth today have languages with no connection, languages which arose spontaneously. But over and above this, psychics in every community retained a telepathic capacity.
By then, the remaining telepaths had formed a secret order.
The order at every stage had to remain outside society, within it, but at the same time not of it. A secret order. Secrecy is not something which we think a good thing, but it is essential for survival. And as society developed, it became more and more essential for survival. The old saying is, where do you hide a pebble but on the beach? You can't keep your order secret by going off into a remote place, into a monastery, and cutting yourself off from civilization. It's essential that you interpenetrate the society. Not for any purpose of power, which is the usual aim of most secret societies, but for your own protection. And a secondary function, as far as I can see, from my knowledge of the history of the order, they tried at every stage of history to influence for the good the way history was developing. And their peculiar faculties gave them the capacity to do so. The dangers were very great. The telepathic capacity is the great danger. It's the great source of danger. Kings, princes, made prisoners of telepaths to use them to interpret the thinking of those around them, to know who are their enemies, where the threats came from.
When members of the order first came to Ireland, they found that a mighty druidic organization existed there.
Members of the order were druids. They infiltrated the druidic organization, which was a highly complex one, and slightly, well, not slightly, but considerably different in Ireland from the continental druids who are described by Caesar in his De Bello Gallicus, the Gallic Wars. Most of his information came from a druid named Divitiacus, who was living in Rome. And according to Divitiacus, the druids were the priests and philosophers and astronomers of the Celtic tribes. They were also magicians and lawgivers. Possibly priest kings, but he doesn't make that clear. Now, Caesar was particularly interested in the religions of subject peoples, because the Romans believed that if they captured the idols, they had the gods and the people made no more resistance to them. That was one of their techniques of conquering and ruling. It served both purposes. Now the Druids, according to Caesar, there have been doubts thrown on whether this Divitiacus existed or not. But according to Caesar, these Druids had a great annual ceremony in which... Now, these ceremonies were carried out usually in oak groves. The oak was a sacred tree to the Celts and to a lot of Aboriginal people, or primitive peoples, who saw spirits in rocks and stones and rivers and growing things of all kinds. The name of the oak, the root term for oak is drua, and from drua, from the practitioners under the oak groves, they got the term druids or druidi, which was the Roman term for druids. Now in Ireland, by coincidence, synchronicity, call it what you like, the Druidic order were worshippers of the god of the sunset, the Da Rua, the red god. And a priest of that order would be called a Chela Da Rua, a servant of the red god. And with a very common thing that happens with language nowadays, we drop the first term. We drop the substantive for the adjective. That process has continued all through time in language. So Chela Da Rua became Da Rua, and Da Rua became Drua or Druid. So that's how the confusion arises between the Druids of Ireland, the Druids of the continent. They have the same name, but for different reasons. Possibly a lot of the fame and esteem that the Druids earned for their knowledge and wisdom derived from the fact that members of the order were among them.
Now, were these figures personifications of the sacred tree, of the rejuvenatory qualities? And I'll be showing you in a minute this whole notion of returning to origins, this idea of moving back to the origin for healing and for initiation, something that we've lost, but it's now coming back to us in ways that are unexpected. The notion of returning to the original essence, which was what the yew tree was all about, continually folding it back on itself to reinstate itself, to regrow itself, something that's incredibly rejuvenative, which was symbolized by these boats and by these figures on a journey back to the origin, back to the beginning. Not in an aggressive sense necessarily, but in more of a sort of ritual sense. And this is some of the secret of the information that comes down to us from the yew, the sense of finding the health, finding the transformation from the sense of going back to origins. We see in alchemy, the prima materia, material that has not been touched by anything else, that's pure, that hasn't been damaged. So this is going back to origins to find this primal stuff, Kerouan's cauldron, coming over from the island of the Blessed with this protoplasmic substance in the bottom of the boat. And the yew trees, something you should know, they're hermaphroditic. Yew trees are known to change their sexes. Yew tree in Hungary recently has been recorded in doing so. Karen and I were talking just the other day, and she was talking about two trees, yew trees, one female, one male, that have kind of combined. And this hermaphroditic sense is really crucial in this understanding of the yew. These figures essentially are hermaphroditic because the penis can be taken away. The whole idea is looking at this undifferentiated state this moving backward to this undifferentiated state of being where sex had not been determined. This place of, we could almost say that somehow they knew. What did they know? We know it in terms of stem cells, right? This pluripotent material that can become anything. But they understood it in a different way. But embryology is not a new science. Here's a close-up of the figures. These quartzite eyes. Sometimes the left eye would be deeper than the other. So there's this Odin connection too to these figures. The Ralligan figures are much more pronounced in this difference with the eyes. And often when I was under the tree, actually, it's really strange, but the hallucinogenic toxin from the bark burns your eyes. And strangely enough, it was often my left eye that would burn. It was the strangest thing. Sometimes both, but there's a real burning sensation, sometimes on your skin too, from being under the yew. So I want to draw out some sense here of what the tree was really about, and what was lost and deliberately oppressed about these trees was the feminine quality, was the birthing nature of these trees. And my sense is that these trees were birthing chambers, as well as a lot of other things, but very, very importantly, they were birthing chambers. As we see here from Anatolia, so modern-day Turkey, from 5,000 to 7,000 BC, these birthing chambers connected to the bull, and the bull's horns, of course, being an image of fallopian tubes. So these are birthing centres from Turkey. Croghan Hill in Ireland, we can see this. What does this look like? It looks like a pregnant belly, right? It's incredible. Some of these passage graves that we have were not really to do with death necessarily, to do with birth. They were probably incredibly connected to birth. Here we have Traprain Law, which is the one near the yew tree, and I had many experiences on top of this hill and around this hill that were very rejuvenative. And this is very much a sense of the sort of the womb-like nature of the landscape here. The tree being connected, almost like an umbilical cord to this hill. It's not very far from it, and geomantically there's a lot of alignments and stones that connect this hill up with the yew tree. There's a lifetime of research to be done here. You can think of the Newgrange. Often I think of it as a birthing chamber. Now we have to look back a little further. So figurines carved with the yew branch at the vulva. Here we see this. It shows up all the time in these ancient carvings. Yew branch here from 5,200 BC. Again, same thing. So there's deep connections between the yew and birth. This is a really beautiful platter, 3,500 BC. We can see again the yew tree connected to the vulva there. And all of these spirals, which could potentially be maybe the yew berries. And if we want any more proof of just the connections of birth and the yew tree, we just have to look at this. This is taken from Fred Hageneder, and look at the stork here. Stork, clearly a symbol of birth. The stork standing on top of the yew rune. And how much clearer can you get than that? And if you look at these images, some of them from Holland and Germany, it's very, very clear that this tree was extremely bound up with birth and rebirth. Even to the Rosetta Stone here, to the second last image, the Tree of Life image there, the Rosetta Stone, which you see in Rosslyn Chapel and places like that. And here again we see the yew rune being very connected with the tree. So this is where we go into embryology for a bit. So bear with me on this. So how does this fit into the yew tree? And why is it the embryonic tree of life? Partly because the embryo also is something that grows upwards and downwards at the same time. We think about the embryo, a human embryo, in the very early stages, the heart begins above the head. There's no head yet. So the heart begins at the top. The primordial heart space begins at the top and actually has to descend. And as it descends, the head ascends. So the heart descends, the head ascends. So we have this kind of connection. There's nobody sitting here that hasn't had their heart turned upside down. Not a single one of you. In more ways than one. We see here this image to the left of the heart having descended down from the head area. The heart is now here, where it was formerly above the head. So we have this primordial heart coming down, and there's a sense to me of this the blood connection to the yew tree. We looked at that earlier, the yew blood. Now, embryologically, we know that the blood begins on the outside. It's not dependent on the heart. The heart is not a pump. The blood begins on the outside, and it actually, when there's a movement, a switch of orientation in the womb, which creates the first midline, we have suddenly this sense of blood moving up and creating the heart. So the blood comes from the outside and brings the heart into being. The blood has its own circulation, particularly the venous blood, which I've been doing a lot of work with now, connected to the yew tree, but actually embodying. And this is the crucial thing here. You can look at this for forever, but if you don't embody the lesson of the yew tree, embodying these movements of blood, embodying this outside-in quality, embodying this sense of bringing in a center, coming to the center from the outside, and this sense of space, inversion, what was inside being outside, what was outside being inside, what was up being down, what was down being up. And all of this was a practice. We're talking about something here that was a practice, a very, very evolved practice that was imprinted under the tree, which in a sense, through visions and through ritual that I saw, and things that happened to my body, there was clearly a sense of, let's call it a shamanic initiation. Shamanic initiation is being an embryological process. So for me, it's like looking at this whole notion of initiation in a completely different way, as an essentially embryological. You can link so much of what we have in terms of shamanic initiation to embryological movements, and especially in the first 4 weeks of embryological development. It's quite incredible. You can see here this, what the Germans call delamination, coming out of the plane. The embryo starts off as a two-dimensional being. It has to take hold of the dimensions of space. It has to fold space in on itself, similar to the yew tree, create space. So the yew tree the gestures of the yew tree were seen. The ancient people, the pre-Celtic people, really embodied the gesture of the tree itself. They didn't jump past the tree. They didn't have a vision that was something beyond the tree. It was the gestures of the tree that were important. And we'll see how this becomes important a little later. So we have this notion of the inverted tree I was talking about, and these. Let me just go back to this for a second. Not to get too complicated here, but top left picture, this is a two-dimensional image where you really were a two-dimensional being. And you can see that as you move to the right image, that yolk sac there becomes absorbed, and what was behind, the amnion, becomes the sort of the outside, and what was in front, as a yolk sac, becomes the center. So we're all used to having these incredible inversions and being turned inside out, essentially. And when you go under that yew tree, that's the experience. The experience is of being literally turned inside out. And when the experiences I had under the tree was often of being in my blood, 20 feet from my body, or being in my bone somewhere completely outside my body, but coming back into my body. There was a lot of circulatory movements. They're incredibly powerful movements, and sometimes quite painful, of being on the periphery and exchanging the periphery with a center, or bringing something from this periphery into the center, and often was my blood. So a big aspect of my initiation under the tree was blood. Extraordinary. The nefesh of the Egyptians, this soul blood. And we're not going to go into this just now because there's not time, but the Aurea Catena, the golden chain of Homer, if you look down that sequence, at some point I'll do another talk of this and relate it to embryology. This is an embryological sequence. Describes it perfectly. The formation of the midline, the formation of a center. So we had this ancient embryology that was practiced, that was embodied. We're linking this now with Karen's song. The unpronounceable. Yahweh being connected with a yew. And other people have talked about this a lot, and I know Michael Sarian has talked about this. We look at the breaking down the word Yahweh, connecting that with Jehovah. Yah is one, God, or male, and Hova is female. So we can see this hermaphroditic quality coming through again. Connections with the yew rune. And with this Adam Kadmon figure, this figure that's undifferentiated. So, going from there, I want to talk a little bit about some of the actual detail Now this is a stone from Scotland called the Golspie stone. And this figure on the left I want to talk about a little bit, because this, what you're looking at right there, is the Druid. The bird-faced Druid, which shows up a lot in these old stones, and showed up all the time in my visions under the tree. And often they were very, very Egyptian. And that puzzled me for a long time. Why would be Egyptian thematic under a tree in Scotland? Not in Egyptian in the detail that we see in the images, but more sort of raw, more pared down, but very, very unmistakably Egyptian. That's what it seemed like to me, and I could never figure this out. But I've got closer to understanding this now. But these figures here were the Druids. These were the Druid shamans of that area, and they always wore, or they had a bird mask or a bird face. I called them the bird shamans in the Soul Companions book. And I came across this, which I found was really fascinating, was these two bird shamans, these two bird druids, holding this head between their beaks, this whole denoting of some kind of initiatory, some kind of initiation into the mysteries, or something like that. And these bird-headed shamans led me on quite a merry dance at times, I'll tell you. We had quite a lot of information came from these bird shamans, bird druids. Much of the time connected to animals, working with dissections, specific ways of working with blood and heart. And these druids had a very evolved practice that they embodied, and it was almost like the sort of yogic practice. It was incredibly, incredibly, amazingly evolved practice of working with the body, of working with space, and something that was obviously very threatening, that was very, very evolved, and was used very much as a healing practice. This image from Crete here, we can see the bird figures again. Can you make those out at the bottom of the tree? These bird shamans initiating. And that tree there cannot be anything other than a yew tree. The way that it grows, the branches growing from the trunk out towards the space. So wherever you look, you see these bird shamans showing up. I love this image, again from Crete, where we see the salmon and the bird above the tree of life, and then that strange little image next to the bird. It looks almost like a heart or an embryo. So I love this image from the bird shaman sort of in a trance, dancing and working with the information, this embryological information. And of course the connections with Thoth and Hermes as a great Druid, the Egyptian connections with these two, and the fact that essentially I really do feel that from the experiences of the tree that there was a migration of knowledge from the British Isles into Egypt that influenced a lot of these practices. And looking at that a little bit, here's a double disc in Z-rod, which you see a lot in Scotland. And you can see how closely that resembles the yew rune. I'm not going to get into that too much just now, but there are some theories that some of you may know about this depicting, they call it the spectacles, so far from the truth, depicting a twin comet. See it here too. This is the Aberlemno stone, which is very close to where my parents live. And the Elgin stone, there's a drawing of it here. We see these people fleeing in the same direction, animals fleeing, humans fleeing, and above that there, this twin comet with the Z-rod through it. And now that bird shaman again, the bird druid. And there's some work that analyzes this stone as basically the depiction on the exact dating of a time that a twin comet struck the northeast and basically sunk. A lot of the landmass was sunk beneath the waves. There were great tsunamis, electrical storms, and a lot of people had to migrate. And again, this could be connected to the whole Atlantis myth. But you can see that maybe this bird druid is trying to prevent this, or trying to hold back this inevitable. But this is an astrological stone, and the significance of this stone is very, very interesting. You see the sign of Hermes at the top with the three images of the ram Aries 3 times, thrice, at the top there of the image. And also the bird heads, stylized birds' heads at the very top. These 2 stylized birds' heads here. And then the thrice Hermes here. And this dragon, which is representing the actual comet, striking. You see the stone here again. You see the twin comet at the bottom. You see how connected we are with these bird shamans. That was the original stone that I found this carving on. Bird shamans again. You see them again here in Thoth. So it could be possible that there was a comet strike that was seen as a kind of dragon or a serpent. It displaced people from the northeast. And in Scotland, a lot of the geology has never been really fully explained. Some of the strikes to certain sides of the mountains are very different from the other sides, implying that there was a strike. And the old red sandstone has layers of basalt above it that have never been explained either. So there was clearly a great cataclysm that took place in Scandinavian countries in the northeast. And even from geological surveys here, Ben More on Mull, which is supposed to have one time been a sacred site and a huge mountain, may safely be computed that Mull includes the most complicated igneous centre as yet recorded detailed examination anywhere in the world. That's directly from a geological survey. Staffa, this dumping of these basilar columns, which some people have argued may be the actual nucleus of the comet that was actually dumped down into the sea in Scotland. And Shetland Isles may have been much larger and connected to Orkneys. So we can see that people who were facing this cataclysm would have needed to leave, and they may have even taken their trees with them. I mean, it may explain why as Ralph Ellis says, the Egyptian tree of life is the yew tree. May have explained, because it doesn't grow there, that these trees were transported. And of course we know that the yew can grow from saplings. So the yews may have been taken over and replanted in places and kept in pots, like we've seen in some of these images here, as a sacred tree. And of course that knowledge was gradually lost. So if that's the case, and what is generally understood is that the comet strike, one of many, but the northeast of Scotland actually survived the best out of all of Scotland there. And strangely enough, that's where this tree is. And that's also where the nearby tree is. So if these trees survived, which it talks about in the Voluspa, tree of life, Yggdrasil survives. It gets shaken, but it survives. If we're talking about really a literal reading of facts there, these trees could have survived the incredible catastrophe that took place. And if that's the case, these trees could be thousands upon thousands of years older than are estimated. So we're looking here, we could be looking at some of the most ancient beings, sentient beings on our planet. These trees, right in Scotland, right in the southeast of Scotland. And my sense is that there was much later in history, there was a sort of I'm not going to call it a secret society, but a series, a group that basically were instrumental in protecting these trees, but not wanting the knowledge to really be known about. So this is for another talk, but there's evidence that suggests that this knowledge was deliberately suppressed, and the cutting down of the trees was part of it. This kind of political reasons, but the underneath that was also this convenient excuse to destroy the trees and just to erase this great practice. But now we see that it's now beginning to come back. Strangely enough, as a cure for cancer, the trees cannot be really ignored. In the 1960s, the experiments were done. National Cancer Institute began to realize that these trees were a great cure for cancer, and tests were carried out through the bark and the needles. And now it's mostly, a lot of it's synthesized, but a lot of the Pacific yews in the northwest of the US have been lost. And now there are farms of these trees which are going to threaten the genetic diversity, because what they do is they take the sort of more pared down genetic information so that the trees can grow faster, but that's actually going to damage these older trees ultimately. So there is some danger here for these older trees. So there's a lot of threads there that I'm going to leave that I can't possibly bring together in this short period of time. But essentially, we're looking here at a tree that was at one time this incredible place of rejuvenation and initiation into the mysteries, that was connected with the body, that was something that was embodied. It was a practice that we've largely lost. But some of us are trying to work with it, and it's coming out in some interesting places. I often think of Goethe's work and the anthroposophists, and how they actually were privy to some more ancient knowledge, perhaps through Goethe's connections. That knowledge resurfaced. So that knowledge has become available again to the West.